Picture this. It's November 14th, 2013. A Thursday morning in rural Sawyer County, Wisconsin. The kind of morning where the sky is the color of a bruise, that deep purple-gray that settles over the Northwoods like a blanket right before the first hard snow. The air smells like frozen pine and dead leaves. Your breath hangs in front of your face like a ghost every time you exhale. It's opening weekend of deer season. And if you've ever been to Wisconsin, or really anywhere in the rural Midwest, you understand what that means. This isn't just a hobby. This isn't just a weekend away with your buddies. Deer season in Wisconsin is practically a religion. Schools take attendance drops. Businesses plan around it. Families schedule it the same way other families schedule Christmas or Thanksgiving. Entire communities exist on the rhythm of it. And Todd Hofflander lived for this weekend. Every year. Without fail. For as long as anyone who knew him could remember. Todd was 43 years old. A big man, 6 feet tall, built wide across the shoulders the way men get when they've spent decades doing physical work. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a beard that his wife Michelle always said made him look like he belonged somewhere deep in the woods, and brown eyes that his daughter Kayla remembered as always being halfway toward a smile, like he was perpetually on the edge of laughing at some private joke only he knew. He worked in construction. Had his own small crew. Wasn't rich, wasn't poor, just solid. The kind of man who paid his bills, coached Little League when his boys were young, drove a truck with a gun rack, and never once in his life met a stranger he couldn't turn into a friend inside of 20 minutes. He was the kind of man who, when he didn't come home, nobody initially panicked. Because Todd was always fine. Todd was always in the woods, being Todd. Todd was always okay. Until the day he wasn't. His wife Michelle made the call to the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department at 6:47 p.m. on Saturday, November 16th, 2 full days after Todd had driven up to the hunting cabin without her. 2 days. Think about that. Think about how well you have to know someone, how deeply you have to trust their competence and their self-reliance, to wait 2 full days before making that call. She knew the woods up there. She knew Todd. She knew that when he was out hunting, the phone signal dropped to nothing, that he could go stretches of 12, 15, 20 hours without checking in, that he'd sometimes lose track of time so completely that he'd stumble back into the cabin at 2 in the morning still grinning about the deer he'd tracked. She wasn't worried on day 1. Barely worried on day 2. But then the call came back from his hunting partner, Dale Bremer. Dale hadn't seen Todd since Thursday morning. Not since they'd split up at the fork in the logging trail, just after dawn. Not a trace. Not a sound. Todd Hofflander had walked into the Wisconsin Northwoods on the morning of November 14th, 2013. And then he was just gone. What followed over the next 10 years would become one of the most haunting, confusing, and ultimately shattering missing persons cases in the history of Wisconsin's North Country. A case that would test the limits of what a family could endure. A case that would raise questions so disturbing that even the investigators who eventually found answers admitted they wished, in some ways, they hadn't. Because when Todd Hofflander was finally found, all those years later, what came with the discovery wasn't just relief. It was something far, far more complicated. My name is Narrator Name, and this is the story of Todd Hofflander. Stay with me. because this one goes deep. Before we can understand what happened to Todd Hofflander, we have to understand who Todd Hofflander was. Because missing persons cases, the real ones, the ones that dig themselves into your soul and refuse to let go, are never really about the disappearance. They're about the person, the life, the world that got left behind. Todd Michael Hofflander was born on March 9, 1970, in Hayward, Wisconsin, a small city of barely 4,000 people set right in the middle of some of the wildest, most beautiful lake country in the entire United States. Hayward is the kind of place where every other business has the word Northwoods in its name, where the local diner has been open since 1954 and the owner still knows everyone's order, where the nearest city of any real size is a 90-minute drive away, and where that distance from everywhere else isn't a disadvantage, it's the entire point. Todd grew up in a house on Lakeshore Drive, the second of 3 children born to Gerald and Patrice Hofflander. Gerald was a logger. Patrice was a school librarian. They were, by all accounts, exactly the kind of hard-working, no-nonsense Midwestern family that produces men like Todd with almost mechanical consistency. Men who grow up learning that the outdoors isn't a place you visit, it's the place where life actually happens. Men who know how to fix an engine, gut a deer, build a fire in a soaking rain, read cloud cover, navigate by the position of the sun, and sit perfectly still in a deer stand for 6 hours without making a sound. Todd learned to hunt before he learned to drive. His father Gerald took him out for the first time when he was 8 years old, not to shoot anything, just to sit, just to listen, just to understand the woods the way the woods needed to be understood, slowly, quietly, with respect. Dad always said the woods would take care of you if you took care of them, Todd's younger brother Randy told investigators years later. He taught Todd that first. Then Todd taught me. By high school, Todd was known as one of the best trackers in Sawyer County. This wasn't a casual reputation. People around there took tracking seriously. It was almost a sport. And Todd had a gift for it, an almost unnatural ability to read terrain, to notice bent grass and scraped bark and the slight disturbance of leaf litter that most people would walk right past without a second thought. His high school biology teacher, a man named Frank Ostrowski, used to say that Todd Hofflander could find a deer in a 1,000-acre forest just by thinking like one. He graduated from Hayward High in 1988, tried a semester at Northland College in Ashland, and then came home. College wasn't his world. The trades were. He apprenticed with a local construction company, learned framing, roofing, and concrete work, and by the time he was in his late 20s had built his own small crew of 4 guys who handled residential and light commercial work across a 3-county area. He married Michelle Gaver in 1996. They'd met at a New Year's Eve party at the Elks Lodge. She'd been there with someone else, he'd been there with his buddies, and somehow by midnight they'd ended up talking about their respective families' fishing traditions for 2 hours while everyone else danced. She was a nurse. Practical, warm, sharp-tongued in the best possible way, and utterly unimpressed by Todd's hunting reputation, which she always claimed she found endearing rather than compelling. "I didn't care that he was good in the woods," Michelle told a local reporter years after his disappearance. "I cared that he was good to people. And he was. He was genuinely good to people. That's rarer than you think." They had 3 kids together: Kyle, born in 1998, Jake, born in 2001, and Kayla, born in 2004, the youngest, who would be 9 years old the November her father walked into the woods and didn't come back. Here's what everyone who knew Todd agreed on: he was not the kind of man who got lost. This is crucial. This is absolutely central to understanding why his disappearance was so instantly, deeply unsettling to everyone who knew him. Todd had hunted those particular woods in Sawyer County, the Chequamegon National Forest, specifically the section northeast of Radisson, for over 20 years. He knew that land the way most people know their own neighborhood. He'd hunted it in every season, in every weather condition, in daylight and darkness. He'd helped find other hunters who'd gotten disoriented up there, twice actually, in reported incidents that the sheriff's department had documented. He carried a compass. He carried a GPS unit. He carried a hand-drawn map that he'd updated and refined over 2 decades of experience. He carried emergency supplies, a first aid kit, a thermal blanket, a fire-starting kit, and enough food and water for a 48-hour survival scenario. He had, in the language of people who take these things seriously, excellent woodcraft. Which meant that when Dale Bremer called Michelle on that Saturday evening and said he hadn't seen Todd since Thursday morning, that Todd's truck was still at the trailhead, that his hunting blind was empty, that his gear bag was untouched, something about that information hit Michelle Hofflander with a force that bypassed her rational mind entirely. Because she understood, immediately and completely, what it meant. If Todd was missing in those woods, it wasn't because he got turned around. Something else had happened. Something she hadn't let herself name yet. Something she would spend the next 10 years trying to understand. The Sawyer County Sheriff's Department initiated a formal search and rescue operation on the morning of Sunday, November 17, 2013. By that point, Todd had been missing for approximately 72 hours. In wilderness search and rescue, the first 72 hours are everything. That's the window. That's when someone who's injured, hypothermic, or disoriented can still be found alive if the search is aggressive and organized enough. After 72 hours, the calculus shifts. Not to hopelessness. Investigators are careful never to say hopeless, but to a different kind of probability. Sheriff Dale Corcoran, who led the initial search operation, had been with the department for 18 years. He'd run missing person cases before, mostly hunting accidents, a few lost hikers, one boating incident that had turned tragically fatal. He was methodical, experienced, and by his own admission, rattled. Something felt off from the start, Corcoran later said. In my experience, when a hunter goes missing, there's almost always a logical explanation that shows itself pretty quickly. An injury, a fall, a medical event, something. With Todd, we just couldn't find a thread to pull on. There was nothing. The initial search covered an 8-square-mile grid centered on the point where Todd and his hunting partner Dale had separated Thursday morning. Over the first 3 days, that search involved 47 volunteers, 6 search and rescue dogs, 2 drone units, and a Wisconsin National Guard helicopter providing aerial surveillance. They found Todd's blind. His thermos, still containing cold coffee. Boot prints leading away from the blind heading northeast, toward a section of the forest that backed up against the upper Chippewa River. And then, nothing. The boot prints simply stopped. Not in mud or standing water where they might have been washed away. They stopped in a section of dry, packed forest floor, amid a carpet of pine needles and frost-hardened leaves that should have held some impression, some trace, some evidence of passage. They stopped like a period at the end of a sentence. And then there was nothing. Dale Bremer, Todd's hunting partner of 14 years, was interviewed extensively in those first days. He was 61 years old, a retired mail carrier from Radisson, a quiet and deeply private man who visibly struggled to hold himself together when talking to investigators. He and Todd had hunted together every season since 1999. They had a system, a routine, a rhythm that had been refined over more than a decade of partnership. They'd drive up Thursday morning, set up their respective blinds, and hunt separately. Todd preferred the northeast section of the property, Dale liked the southern ridge, checking in by radio every 4 hours, meeting back at the cabin by 6 p.m. for dinner. The last radio check-in from Todd had come at 8:14 a.m. on Thursday. He said he'd spotted a nice 8-pointer working the tree line about 200 yards northeast, Dale told investigators. He sounded fine. He sounded excited. He always got excited when deer season started. I told him I hadn't seen anything yet and that I'd check in again at noon. He said, "Yep, copy that, talk to you then." At noon, Dale's radio crackled but produced no answer. He assumed Todd was tracking. It happened. He tried again at 4 p.m. Still nothing. He drove the logging trail to Todd's section of the property at 5 p.m. and found the blind empty. He drove back to the cabin, convinced Todd had come back a different way. But the cabin was empty too. And when Dale drove back out to the trailhead, Todd's truck was still sitting exactly where he'd left it at 6 in the morning. "That's when I knew," Dale said, his voice very quiet. "That's when I knew it was wrong." Dale had spent Thursday night and all of Friday conducting his own informal search before calling Michelle Saturday evening. He'd walked every trail he and Todd had ever used together. He'd called Todd's name until his voice gave out. He'd told investigators later that in 40 years of hunting those woods, he had never felt afraid of them until that Friday night, standing in the dark, calling Todd's name into a silence that felt, somehow, like it was listening back. The organized search continued for 8 days. On day 4, cadaver dogs were brought in, a decision that the sheriff's department initially resisted making publicly known, not wanting to signal to the family that hope was fading. But it leaked anyway. It always does. The dogs indicated at 2 locations. Both were runoff areas near the upper Chippewa riverbank. Divers were deployed. Nothing was found. By day 8, the active search was scaled back to a passive operation, meaning that searchers would continue to monitor the area and respond to any new information, but the large-scale volunteer deployment was stood down. It was a necessary operational decision. You can't sustain that level of resource deployment indefinitely. Everyone involved in search and rescue understands this. That didn't make it any easier for Michelle Hofflander to watch the volunteers disperse. "You see the trucks pull away," she said later, "and something in you just, it's like a door closing. You tell yourself it's not a door, it's just a pause. They're not giving up. Nobody's giving up. But somewhere inside you, you know what it means." Sheriff Corcoran stood with her that last morning, hands in his pockets, watching the final truck disappear around the bend. "I told her we weren't done," he said later. "And I meant it. I meant every word of it. We weren't done. We were never done with Todd Hofflander's case." What he didn't tell her, what nobody told her yet, was that the investigation had already begun quietly pivoting. away from search and rescue, toward something else entirely. Here's a thing that most people don't understand about missing persons investigations. There is a moment, sometimes sharp, sometimes gradual, when the case stops being a rescue operation and becomes a criminal investigation. Nobody announces it. Nobody holds a press conference and says, "We are now treating this as potentially criminal in nature." That would terrify the family, contaminate potential witnesses, and cause a cascade of problems that experienced investigators know to avoid. But the pivot happens. And in the Todd Hofflander case, investigators later confirmed that the pivot happened around day 5. The reason was partly the cadaver dog indications near the river, which, while producing no physical evidence, couldn't be easily explained away. But the bigger reason was something discovered during the routine background investigation that detectives conduct on every missing adult. Something that changed the shape of the case entirely. Let me be precise here, because the details matter. When someone goes missing, even in circumstances that initially appear accidental, investigators run what's called a comprehensive background review. Bank records, phone records, known associates, any history of mental health issues, substance abuse, financial problems, legal trouble. Not because they're assuming the worst, but because the information might point toward an explanation. What Todd's investigators found in those first 5 days was, on its surface, innocuous. Or almost innocuous. Todd's finances were solid. No unusual transactions. No large cash withdrawals. No debts beyond his mortgage and a truck payment. His phone records showed normal activity right up to the morning of November 14th. A text to Michelle at 6:03 a.m., heading out, "Love you, back tonight or tomorrow." A text to his son Kyle at 6:22 a.m., "Your birthday present is in the garage. Don't open it yet." And then nothing. His phone, like Dale Bremer's, had lost signal somewhere in the forest. Standard for that area. But there was one thing. One small, easy-to-overlook thing that a detective named Patricia Garza noticed on day 5 while reviewing Todd's cell records for the 3rd time. On October 31st, 2 weeks before Todd's disappearance, there had been a series of calls between Todd's cell phone and a number that didn't match any of his known contacts. 3 calls, all under 2 minutes, all placed in the late afternoon. The number was a prepaid cell phone registered to a gas station purchase made with cash. A burner phone. Now, let's be careful here. Let's be fair to the memory of a man who can't speak for himself. There are legitimate, completely innocent reasons why someone might use a burner phone. They're used by people protecting their privacy, by people buying surprise gifts, by people in all manner of situations that have nothing whatsoever to do with anything criminal or dangerous. Detective Garza knew this. She flagged it as a data point, not a conclusion. But combined with one other thing she'd found, one other small irregularity in the picture of Todd Hofflander's final weeks, it was enough to make her take the case home with her at night and stare at the ceiling. The other thing was this: 3 of Todd's construction crew members, when interviewed separately and without coordination, all mentioned the same thing. That in the weeks before deer season, Todd had seemed distracted. Not unhappy, not depressed, not angry, not frightened. Just somewhere else. Like he was thinking through a problem that he hadn't shared with anyone. One crew member, a young man named Brian Hollick who'd worked for Todd for 2 years, put it this way: it was like he was waiting for something. You know how someone looks when they're waiting for something big to either go right or go wrong? Like they're holding their breath? That was Todd, those last few weeks. Was this meaningful? Was this relevant? Or was it the perfectly ordinary human tendency to look backward at a tragedy and retrofit the preceding weeks with a significance they didn't actually have? Garza couldn't know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she wrote it in her notebook and she circled it 3 times. The investigation produced 3 primary theories in those first months. Theory 1. Accidental death. Todd had suffered a medical emergency, heart attack, stroke, sudden onset of something, in a part of the forest that the search had somehow missed, and his body had not yet been found. This was the most statistically likely explanation. It happened to hunters. It happened to people who were in good health and expected to be fine. The woods were vast, and the search, however thorough, was not and could never be omniscient. Against this theory, the cadaver dogs hadn't found him. He had no documented cardiac history. His last physical, 6 months prior, had showed nothing of concern. And Todd's level of woodcraft meant that even if he'd felt unwell, he almost certainly would have attempted to make his way back toward the logging trail rather than deeper into the forest. Theory 2. Voluntary disappearance. Todd had chosen to walk away from his life. This was the theory that investigators discussed carefully and privately, far away from Michelle and the kids. People did this. It was rarer than the movies suggested, but not as rare as loved ones wanted to believe. The combination of the burner phone calls, the waiting for something observation from his crew, and the clean slate of his body and truck, no blood, no trauma, nothing suggesting violence, could potentially support this. Against this theory, everyone who knew Todd, and Garza had interviewed a lot of people who knew Todd, describe him as not just contented but actively, genuinely fulfilled. He loved his family. His relationship with Michelle was, by all consistent accounts, solid and loving. He adored his kids, his daughter Kayla especially, who was 9 and who he called Kayla Bug. The idea that he had chosen to walk away from her was, to everyone who knew them together, incomprehensible. Theory 3. Foul play. Someone had done something to Todd Hofflander. Against this theory, no motive had been identified. No known enemies. No one who'd threatened him. No evidence of a struggle or altercation at or near the scene. For this theory, the burner phone, the distraction, and one more thing, one detail that Garza hadn't mentioned to the family, that hadn't appeared in any public statements, that she held close and quiet while she worked. The boot prints that stopped. Not in the middle of the trail. Not near a natural hazard. They stopped in an open section of forest, about 80 feet from the nearest logging trail, the kind of trail that a vehicle could navigate. Garza had measured the distance herself, in the cold, standing among the pine needles, imagining the geometry of it. If you wanted to take someone out of those woods without leaving a trace, 80 feet from a drivable trail was exactly where you'd want it to happen. And then time passed. This is the part of the story that the news cameras miss. The part that doesn't make headlines or generate tip lines or prompt dramatic press conferences. The years. The slow, grinding, relentless march of days that a family spends suspended between 2 impossible states, grief and hope. Unable to mourn completely because there was no confirmed death. unable to move forward completely because there was no confirmed life. This is the purgatory of missing. There's no word in the English language adequate to describe what it does to a family. The technical term investigators and grief counselors use is ambiguous loss. But that phrase, clinical and precise as it is, doesn't begin to capture what it feels like to set a table with one fewer plate than it should have. To answer your child's question, "Is Daddy coming back?" with an honest response that isn't yes or no but something worse than either. To go to parent-teacher conferences alone. To watch your son's baseball game alone. To lie in bed alone and listen to the house settle around you and wonder, as you will always wonder, what really happened. Michelle Hofflander had Kyle, who was 15 when his father vanished and 25 when the truth finally emerged. She had Jake, 13 when it happened and 23 by the end. And she had Kayla, 9 years old the November morning her father kissed her goodbye in the driveway and told her to have a good day at school, 9 years old and now 19, the entirety of her adolescence spent with a question mark where her father should have been. Michelle stayed in Hayward. She went back to work at the hospital 2 months after Todd vanished. She joined a support group for families of missing persons in Eau Claire that she drove to once a month, 90 miles each way, because it was the only place she knew of where people understood, not sympathized, not pitied, but actually understood, what she was living with. "People want to help," she said once, in a recorded support group session that was later shared with investigators as background context. "And they do help. They bring food, they call, they check in. But there comes a point where you can see in their eyes that they've resolved it. They've decided, internally, what happened. And usually what they've decided is that he's gone, that he died out there and he'll be found eventually or he won't. And they've made their peace with it. And you love them for it, but you can't go there with them. Because you don't know. You genuinely don't know. And living in that not knowing is the loneliest thing in the world." She never had Todd declared legally dead. A lot of families do, especially after 7 years, when Wisconsin law allows it, because it simplifies insurance, estate, practical matters. Michelle refused. Her attorney advised her twice. She politely declined both times. "He's not dead until I know he's dead," she told the attorney. "And I don't know that." Kyle graduated high school in 2016. He enrolled at UW Stout to study construction management, his father's trade, his father's world. At his high school graduation, when they called his name and he walked across the stage, he stopped before he sat back down, turned toward the audience, and pointed upward. Just for a second. Just because he needed to. Jake graduated 2 years later. He became a mechanic. He got a tattoo on his right forearm when he turned 18, Todd's initials, and the date November 14th, 2013, and an 8-pointed deer antler, because 8 points was what Todd had seen that last morning before the radio went silent. Kayla grew up. She played volleyball in high school. She was good enough to earn a partial scholarship to a small college in the up of Michigan. She was an honor student. She was funny and quick and had, by all accounts, her father's gift for turning strangers into friends. But she also had nightmares. She'd had them since she was 9. She'd told her mother about them, always the same general shape. Her father in the woods, walking away from her. She calling his name. Him not turning around. Not because he couldn't hear her, she always said, it was the specific horror of dreams, but because he chose not to. I know it's not real, she told a therapist. I know it's just my brain. But I wake up from it and I can feel the leaves under my feet and the cold air and my voice going hoarse from calling him. And I have to just lie there and remind myself what's real and what isn't. And then I remember that I don't actually know what's real. I don't know what happened. And then I can't sleep again until morning. The investigation, meanwhile, had never fully closed. Detective Patricia Garza had retired from the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department in 2018, but had never fully put Todd's case down. She'd taken her notes and her files, personal copies, nothing proprietary, and kept working it from home the way some investigators do when a case gets into their blood. She'd found one more thing in 2016, 3 years after Todd vanished. Something that hadn't seemed significant at the time it first appeared in the record, but that she'd circled in red ink and stared at for a long, long while. In September 2013, 2 months before Todd's disappearance, a man named Robert Elias Cutter had purchased, with cash, a parcel of land approximately 12 miles north-northeast of the Hofflander hunting property. 27 acres. Deep woods. No road access except a single unmarked logging track. No structures. No obvious recreational use. Robert Elias Cutter had no local connections that Garza had been able to verify. No family in the area. No employment history in Sawyer County. He'd purchased the land through a title company in Wausau and had, as far as any record showed, never visited it. Garza had run his name through every database available to her. She'd found fragments. An address in St. Paul, Minnesota. A driver's license, long expired. A single arrest record from 1997, a domestic disturbance call that had resulted in no charges. And then, in 2015, just 2 years after Todd vanished, Robert Elias Cutter disappeared from the public record entirely. No tax filings. No DMV record updates. No property transactions. No death record. Just gone. Like smoke. Garza stared at all of this, and she felt something that experienced investigators describe. That particular combination of certainty and dread when you've been circling a truth for a long time and you can feel its shape even though you can't yet see it clearly. She made a note in her file, Rec. Connection to TH? Investigate further. She couldn't know, in 2016, that it would be another 7 years before that connection became clear. She couldn't know what was out there on those 27 acres, hidden under 10 years of Wisconsin winters and summers and the slow, patient work of the forest reclaiming everything it's owed. She couldn't know. Not yet. There are things people don't say. Not because they're lying. Not because they're malicious or calculating or trying to protect themselves. But because they're not sure. Because certainty, in the human mind, is a prerequisite for speaking. Because saying the thing out loud means it becomes real, and some things are too heavy to make real before you're absolutely sure. Dale Bremer carried something for almost 3 years before he said it aloud. And when he finally said it, he said it to Patricia Garza, retired detective, unofficial investigator, the woman who had never stopped pulling at the threads of this case, in the kitchen of his house in Radisson on a March afternoon in 2016, when the snow was still 2 feet deep outside and the kitchen smelled like coffee and would smoke. He told her what he'd seen at 7:52 a.m. on November 14th, 2013. Not what he'd told investigators the first time. Not the careful, edited version that he'd given in the official interview in the days after Todd vanished. The full thing. The thing he'd been sitting with, alone, for 2.5 years. At 7:52 a.m. that Thursday morning, Dale had been walking the Southern Ridge Trail, his usual route to his blind, when he'd crossed the old logging road that bisected the property from northeast to southwest. From his position on the ridge, he had a partial view down the logging road, maybe 200 yards of it visible through the trees before it curved out of sight. He had seen a truck. Not Todd's truck. A different truck. Dark-colored. He thought black or dark green. He couldn't be certain at that distance and in that early morning light. Older model. Big. He couldn't identify the make with confidence, though he thought it might have been a Ford or a Chevy 3/4 ton from somewhere in the late 90s or early 2000s. It was parked on the logging road, facing north. Engine running, he could see exhaust vapor in the cold air. There was someone standing beside it. Male, he thought. Dark coat. He couldn't see a face. He'd watched for maybe 45 seconds. Then the person had gotten back into the truck and driven away, northbound, out of sight. "I thought it was another hunter," Dale told Garza, his voice very careful, each word placed deliberately. "I thought nothing of it. There are hunters all over those woods that time of year. There are always trucks on the logging roads. It didn't register as anything." He stopped, wrapped his hands tighter around the coffee mug. "And then Todd was gone. And I kept asking myself, in the first hours, in the first days, whether that truck had anything to do with it. Whether that person had anything to do with it. And I kept telling myself no. I kept telling myself I was reaching. That I'd seen a hunter, parked on a logging road, who decided to drive out. That's all I'd seen. I couldn't give a plate number. I couldn't give a make. I could barely give a color. What was I going to tell the sheriffs? What use would it be?" He looked at Garza directly for the first time since he'd started talking. "It would have just muddied the water. That's what I told myself. It would have complicated the search and not actually helped find him." Garza was quiet for a moment. "You know, I would have wanted to hear it," she finally said. "Yes," Dale said. "I know that now." Garza didn't blame him. She understood, not condoned, but understood, the logic that had led him to silence. When you're not sure what you saw, when the value of the information is unclear, when you're a private man in a community where people are careful with their words, you can convince yourself that uncertain information is worse than none. You can convince yourself that you're protecting an investigation by not contaminating it with half-glimpsed details. You can be entirely wrong about that while thinking entirely clearly. She had Dale work with a sketch artist. Not a law enforcement sketch artist. She was retired. She didn't have access to one officially. Instead, she used a service that had become available online, a digital artist who worked with witness memory. The process took 3 sessions over 6 weeks. What emerged was a general profile, a large, older model pickup truck, dark-colored, possibly with a lumber rack on the bed, possibly with a dent or damage on the left rear panel. Dale wasn't confident in either of the last 2 details. He marked his confidence level as low to moderate. But it was something. It was the first actual something, other than stopped boot prints and a burner phone and a stranger who'd bought land in the middle of nowhere, in nearly 3 years. Garza looked at the sketch of the truck and then at her notes about Robert Elias Cutter and his 27 acres 12 miles north. She connected them with a line in her notebook. A tentative line. A question mark at each end. But a line. 27 acres doesn't sound like much. But 27 acres of dense Northwoods Wisconsin forest, without road access, with a single unmarked logging track as the only way in, deep in a part of Sawyer County where the nearest occupied house is 4 miles away? 27 acres like that is an entire world. It's a world where sound doesn't travel far enough to matter. Where a single human being, or everything that was once a single human being, could exist for years without being found by anyone who wasn't specifically looking. And even then, without knowing approximately where to look, you could search those 27 acres for weeks and find nothing. Patricia Garza had found the parcel in 2016. For 2 years after that, she'd tried unsuccessfully to locate Robert Elias Cutter, the man who'd purchased it, and had come up empty. By 2018, the year she retired, she'd shared her findings informally with Sheriff Corcoran's office, which had noted them without being able to act on them. There was no evidence directly connecting Cutter or his land to Todd's disappearance. Nothing that would support a warrant. Nothing that could compel an official investigation into the property. The law requires reasons. And the reasons Garza had were, as she acknowledged herself, built on fragments and intuition and the kind of connective tissue that experienced investigators feel rather than see. A cash purchase. A disappearance from public records. A proximity on the map. A dark truck on a logging road. None of it was enough. And so the land sat. 27 acres of deep forest, owned by a man nobody could find, saying nothing to anyone. In the spring of 2019, 5.5 years after Todd vanished, Garza hired a private investigator named Theo Mansfield to see if he could get further than she had with Robert Cutter. Mansfield was a former Dane County Sheriff's deputy who'd gone private in 2011 and developed a reputation for digging up people who didn't want to be found. He was not glamorous. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru and worked out of a spare bedroom in his house in Madison, but he was methodical and he had a network of contacts in county offices and law firms and title companies across the state that had taken him 20 years to build. He found the thread Garza hadn't been able to reach. The 27 acres in Sawyer County had been purchased through a title company in Wausau. That much was already known. What wasn't known until Mansfield dug into the title company's recorded filings was that the Wausau Title Company had been established in 2012 and had conducted a total of 4 property transactions before going dormant. All 4 involved the same seller, a limited liability company registered in Nevada called Pinnacle Land Holdings, LLC. Nevada LLCs are, by design, exceptionally difficult to trace. They require minimal disclosure, and the state's corporate registry provides almost no useful identifying information about beneficial ownership. But Mansfield was patient. He traced Pinnacle Land Holdings through its registered agent in Nevada, through the agent's other represented entities, through a series of subshells that had been constructed with obvious care, but not quite enough care. Because 4 years before, one of the subshell companies had used an attorney in Milwaukee for a real estate transaction, and that attorney, now deceased, his estate still technically in administration, had listed a sole member for the LLC in a filing that should have been marked private but hadn't been. Robert Elias Cutter. But also a second name. Added as a co-member 2 years after the original filing, and never publicly linked to any of the land purchases. A second name that Garza had not expected. That nobody had expected. Garza stared at the name Mansfield had found. She read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misreading it. And then she sat very still for a very long time. She would not share this name publicly for another 4 years. Not until there was enough to substantiate it. Not until the proof was solid enough that naming it wasn't a cruelty but a reckoning. But she wrote it in her notebook in capital letters and underlined it twice. And she thought about Todd Hofflander's boot prints, stopping in the pine needles 80 feet from a logging road. And she thought about Dale Bremer's dark truck, engine running in the cold morning air. And she understood, for the first time, not just the shape of what might have happened, but something of the why. And the why was, in some ways, worse than the what. The years between 2016 and 2022 were, for the Hofflander family, a study in what it costs to keep hope alive. You think of hope as a sustaining thing, a warm thing, and it can be. But hope maintained against a long silence has another quality to it too, a weight, a relentlessness, an exhaustion that healthy hope doesn't carry. It's the difference between hope as a sunrise and hope as a thing you carry on your back, uphill, for years without rest. Michelle Hofflander carried it. She was, by the account of everyone who knew her during those years, extraordinary in her capacity to function, to go to work, to parent 3 children through adolescence and into adulthood, to maintain the house and the relationships and the daily structure that kept a family's life from collapsing entirely. She was always careful to say, holding it together. She was actually living, working, loving her kids, laughing when there was something to laugh about. But the weight was there. I think about him every single morning, she told a journalist from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel who profiled her in 2019, 6 years after Todd vanished. I don't say it to be dramatic. It's just a fact. Every morning, before I'm fully awake, there's this brief half-second when I don't remember, and then I do, and it doesn't get easier exactly. It gets more familiar. Like a bruise you've had so long you've started to think of it as part of your body. Kyle had, by 2019, completed his degree and was working for a construction company in Eau Claire. He was dating a woman named Gretchen. He coached youth football on weekends. He had his father's broad build and his father's ease with people, and he had never, not once, let the words, "my dad is dead," come out of his mouth, because for Kyle the distinction between missing and dead was absolute and non-negotiable. People say, "I'm sorry for your loss," Kyle told the same journalist. And I say, "Thank you, but I haven't lost anything yet." Because I haven't. I don't know what happened. If somebody showed me a body, if somebody gave me something conclusive, then I'd grieve. Then I'd let myself go there. But right now he's just missing. And I'm not going to bury him in my head before I know the truth. Jake was quieter about it. He always had been, quieter than Kyle, more interior, the one who processed by thinking rather than by talking. He'd moved to Duluth by 2020. He called his mother every Sunday. He'd never taken the tattoo off his arm. He'd never talked to a therapist. He'd been offered grief counseling several times and had declined each time with a politeness that didn't invite further conversation. What he had done, quietly and without telling anyone in his family, was create a website. A simple, well-made website, with his father's photograph and the basic facts of the disappearance and a contact form for anyone with information. He'd registered it in 2015, 2 years after Todd vanished, and had kept it running and updated ever since. Over the years, it had received perhaps 300 contact form submissions, most of them sympathetic but useless, a handful obviously from cranks or the mentally ill, and a small number that he'd forwarded to the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department as potentially meaningful. None of them had led anywhere. Until the contact form received a message in October 2022 from an IP address in Duluth, Minnesota. The message was brief. It said, "I think I know what happened to your father. I am afraid to go to the police. Can we meet?" Jake stared at it for 40 minutes. Then he called his mother. Then his mother called Patricia Garza. October 17th, 2022. 9 years and 11 months after Todd Hofflander walked into the Wisconsin Northwoods and vanished. Jake Hofflander is 31 years old. He's in his apartment in Duluth when the notification comes through to his phone. He reads the message twice, standing in his kitchen. Then he sits down at the kitchen table and reads it again. "I think I know what happened to your father. I am afraid to go to the police. Can we meet?" He doesn't respond immediately. He's smart enough, careful enough, to understand that this message could be anything. It could be genuine. It could be a troubled person seeking attention. It could be a scammer who discovered the website and saw an opportunity. It could be someone with half information who believed they had more. It could also, just possibly, be real. He responds at 11:47 p.m. "Who are you? Why are you afraid to go to the police?" The reply comes back within 4 minutes, which means whoever sent the first message had been sitting there, waiting, watching for a response. "My name is not important yet. I'm afraid because the person involved has connections I don't fully understand and I don't know who I can trust. I have been carrying this for a long time. I don't want to carry it anymore. I will tell you what I know if you can come to Duluth and meet me somewhere public." Jake sits with this for another hour. He runs the IP address through a basic trace. He's not a tech person, but he'd learned enough over the years to do elementary searches, and confirms it resolves to the Duluth metropolitan area. Consistent with the claim. He calls his mother at 1:15 a.m. She answers on the second ring. She hasn't been sleeping well for 9 years. A middle-of-the-night phone call, in the Hofflander house, has never once signified anything good, but Michelle Hofflander answers every one of them without hesitation. She will never not answer. Jake tells her about the message. She's quiet for a long moment. "I'll come," she says. "Wherever the meeting is, I'll come. Mom." Jake. "I'll come." Garza is in the loop by 7 a.m. She'd retired from the department but still had contacts, still had relationships, still had credibility, still had a file on this case that was more comprehensive than anything in the official record. She immediately advises Jake and Michelle on how to handle the contact. Don't share the family's address or phone numbers. Don't arrange anything without a third party present. Insist on a genuinely public location, a coffee shop, a restaurant, somewhere with foot traffic and witnesses. Jake arranges the meeting for October 22nd at a coffee shop on Superior Street in Duluth. He tells the contact only a family representative will be present. He doesn't mention Garza. Garza will be at a separate table, watching. The morning of the 22nd is a gray, drizzly Tuesday. Lake Superior is doing what Lake Superior does in October, sitting out there like a gray inland ocean, indifferent and permanent. Duluth in October has a kind of end-of-the-world beauty, all wet pavement and bare trees and the smell of lake water everywhere, that feels almost deliberately atmospheric given what's about to happen. Jake is at the coffee shop at 8:45 a.m. Garza is 2 tables away, over a newspaper she isn't reading. At 9:02, the door opens. A woman walks in. She's in her mid-40s, Jake estimates. Dark hair, heavily gray at the temples. She's wearing a too large raincoat that suggests she wants to disappear into it. Her eyes scan the room with the hyper-awareness of someone who hasn't felt safe in a very long time. They land on Jake. She clearly recognizes him from some photograph, and she stops for just a moment. Then she walks over and sits down. She orders a coffee she never drinks, and she begins to talk. Her name is Sandra Vogt. She is 46 years old. She has lived in Duluth since 2019, when she moved from Ashland, Wisconsin, after the end of a relationship that she describes, carefully and with precision, as something I should have left years before I did. The relationship had been with a man named Robert Cutter. She says the name evenly, without visible emotion, the way people say the names of things that have frightened them for so long that the fear has converted into a kind of flatness. Jake doesn't react to the name. He doesn't know it. Nobody has told him about Garza's investigation, about the land purchase, about the LLC, about any of it. Michelle had made that decision intentionally, to keep the investigative threads away from the kids, to protect them from the particular cruelty of hope that turns out to be wrong. But from the other table, over her unread newspaper, Patricia Garza goes very, very still. Sandra Vogt takes a breath, and she tells them what she knows. Sandra Vogt met Robert Cutter in the fall of 2010. He was at a bar in Ashland, a place called the Rusty Anchor on the western edge of town, the kind of bar where people who live in small Northwood cities go to be invisible on a weeknight. She'd been going through a divorce. He'd been, she later understood, looking for a woman in a particular kind of emotional vulnerability. She describes him at first meeting as not what you'd expect. Not overtly threatening. Not obviously dangerous. Charming in a low-key, controlled way, the kind of charm that doesn't announce itself, that just makes you feel, for some reason you can't articulate, that you're being seen clearly and valued. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with the kind of outdoors weathered face common in that part of Wisconsin. He drove a dark green Ford F-250, late 1990s model, with a lumber rack on the bed. Over 3 years, Sandra says, she learned that Robert Cutter was a man for whom ordinary life was never quite enough. He wasn't criminal in the small, opportunistic sense that she'd seen in others. He didn't steal. He didn't deal drugs. He ran what appeared to be a legitimate land acquisition business, buying undervalued rural parcels, holding them, occasionally selling them for modest gains. He traveled. He knew people she didn't understand the relationships with. He was secretive about his past in a way that she'd initially found intriguing and later found frightening. He also had money that didn't entirely correspond to the land business. Not dramatic wealth, but comfortable, liquid cash flow that seemed to come from somewhere beside the paper trail of his official operations. I asked him about it once, Sandra says. He told me some of his family money and some consulting work. I didn't push. I know now that I should have pushed. In November of 2013, Robert Cutter was not in Duluth or Ashland. He told Sandra he was going north. Property business, he said. Something related to the Sawyer County parcel. He was gone for 4 days, November 13th through the 17th. He came back on the evening of the 17th. Sandra says he seemed tightly contained, not agitated in a visible way, but with an internal quality she'd learned to recognize, a kind of heightened attentiveness to everything around him, a watchfulness. Like a man who has done something he needs to watch the world for reactions to. She didn't ask about it. By that point in their relationship, she had learned what to ask and what not to ask. But she noticed 2 things. The first, when she did his laundry the following day, one of his outer layer coats, a dark canvas hunting coat, was missing. Not dirty. Not in the hamper. Simply gone. She asked him about it. He said he'd left it up north. The second, when she was in the truck about a week later, running an errand, she looked in the glove compartment for the registration and found, behind the registration folder, a prepaid cell phone. She picked it up and looked at it. It had been used. The battery was dead, and when she charged it later, she found 3 received calls and 3 sent calls. All to and from the same Wisconsin number. She didn't write it down. She was not, she says this flatly, without self-pity, in a mental state at that time to act on things that frightened her. She put the phone back where she found it. The next time she looked for it, 2 days later, it was gone. She heard about Todd Hofflander's disappearance on the local news in late November. The story had made regional coverage. She heard the county, the general location, the time frame. She sat with it. She didn't say anything. She sat with it for 2 years. For 3 years. She sat with it through the end of her relationship with Robert Cutter in 2015, which ended abruptly when she found evidence that he was conducting the same low-grade financial opacity with a second woman in St. Paul that he'd conducted with her. The breakup was not violent, but it was tense, and he'd made, in the aftermath, what she describes as comments that were meant to sound like nothing and were actually meant to tell me what would happen if I became a problem. She sat with it through her move to Duluth in 2019. She sat with it through COVID lockdown and the particular insomnia of isolation and the 3 a.m. awakenings when the things you're not dealing with come and sit on your chest. She sat with it until October 2022, when Jake Hofflander's website appeared in a suggested search on her phone. She'd been reading about missing persons cases, she says, a habit she developed, a way of examining something she couldn't look at directly, and she'd read the missing poster for Todd Hofflander and seen the date November 14th, 2013, and seen the location, and felt the thing that had been sitting in her chest for 9 years rearrange itself into something she couldn't continue to hold. I'm not saying I know what happened to him, she tells Jake, her voice perfectly steady. I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is what I saw, what I know about Robert, what I know about those 4 days and that phone and that coat. And I can tell you that I've been afraid for 9 years of saying it out loud. And I'm done being afraid. She looks across the table. Jake's face is unreadable, the discipline of a young man who has spent a decade learning not to react too quickly to things that might not be true. Who is Robert? He asks. Who is Robert Cutter? Sandra Vogt looks at him. That, she says, is what I don't fully understand. But I think someone needs to find out. 2 tables away, Patricia Garza folds her newspaper and picks up her coffee cup and looks at the ceiling for a moment. Then she takes out her phone and calls the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department. This time, she has more than intuition. This time, She has a witness. Getting a search warrant in a criminal investigation is not the dramatic, instantaneous moment that television has trained us to imagine. It is paperwork and affidavits and probability thresholds, and a judge who has heard 1,000 justifications for searches and who is constitutionally obligated to be skeptical of every one of them. It is the unglamorous, absolutely essential machinery of due process. Detective Ramirez, formerly Detective Sergeant Luis Ramirez of the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department, who had inherited Todd Hofflander's case file in 2020 when he joined the department and who had, to his considerable credit, taken it seriously from the first day, began the warrant application process on October 24, 2022, 2 days after Jake Hofflander's meeting with Sandervoke. What he had, assembled now with Garza's help into a formal investigative package, was this: a 9-year-old missing person case with no resolved explanation, a set of stopped boot prints near a logging road, a burner phone connected to Todd's records, a dark truck witnessed near the scene by a credible witness, a cash land purchase by a named individual in close geographic proximity to the scene, conducted 2 months before the disappearance. That individual's subsequent disappearance from public records. A romantic partner of that individual who placed him in the area during the relevant time frame noted behavioral anomalies consistent with the aftermath of a violent event, and documented the existence of a subsequently destroyed burner phone that had been in his possession. Was it a certainty? No. Was it reasonable probable cause to believe that evidence related to a crime might be present on 27 specific acres of Sawyer County forest? The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Leonard, who had been on the Sawyer County Circuit Court for 11 years, read the affidavit twice. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She signed the warrant. Date: October 28, 2022. 9 years, 11 months, and 14 days after Todd Hofflander disappeared. The search team assembled on the morning of October 31st, Halloween, which nobody mentioned but everyone noticed, because in a story like this the calendar has a dark sense of humor. The team included Detective Ramirez, 2 evidence technicians from the Sheriff's Department, a cadaver K-9 unit from a regional law enforcement K-9 association, and, in a consultative capacity only, Patricia Garza. They were accompanied by a forensic archaeologist named Dr. Marion Voss from UW-Madison, because if this search was going to find what Ramirez increasingly believed it might find, they were going to need someone who understood how to recover evidence from a site that had been exposed to nearly a decade of Wisconsin weather and biological activity. They drove the logging track onto the property at 7:30 a.m. It was a cold morning, just above freezing, with a low overcast that promised rain by afternoon. The forest on the property was mature second growth, birch, aspen, white pine, with a dense undergrowth of tag alder along a small creek that bisected the eastern portion of the parcel. The K-9 unit, a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois named Kova, handled by a woman named Officer Chen, entered the property first. Kova worked back and forth across the property for 40 minutes in disciplined sweeps. She covered the western section, the central section near the creek, the northern end near what might have been a rough clearing at some point but was now thoroughly reclaimed by brush. Then she entered the southeastern quadrant, the quadrant closest to the logging track, closest to the road, closest to the point where Dale Bremer had seen a dark truck parked and running on the morning of November 14, 2013. Kova stopped. She sat down, the alert indicator for her specific training, and looked up at Officer Chen. Then she moved 4 feet to her left and sat down again. Then 3 feet further and sat down a third time. Officer Chen stood very still. Then she looked at Detective Ramirez. "She's got something," she said quietly. "She's got multiple somethings." The forensic archaeology team staked the 3 alert sites and began the painstaking, careful process of preliminary surface examination. This is not digging, not yet. It's reading the ground, looking at the vegetation patterns, the soil disturbance, the way tree roots grow around and through things, the way a decade of freeze-thaw cycles affects buried material. Dr. Voss spent 2 hours on the first site before she looked up. "There's been significant disturbance here," she told Ramirez. "Relatively consistent with a burial or interment. I can't tell you depth or contents from surface examination alone. I can tell you that something was put in the ground here, and the timeline of disturbance indicators is consistent with approximately 8 to 12 years ago." 8 to 12 years. Todd Hofflander had been missing for 9 years. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. Then he made the call he'd been both dreading and hoping to make for the better part of 2 years since he'd taken the case. He called the Sawyer County coroner. And he called Michelle Hofflander. There is a phone call that families of missing persons live with the knowledge of. The call they both need and dread with an equal and simultaneous terror. The call that resolves the question, not happily, almost certainly not happily, but at least with the finality that uncertainty has denied them. Michelle Hofflander had been waiting for this call for 9 years. She had told herself, and therapists, and her children, and the support group in Eau Claire, that she was prepared for it. That she had made her peace. That she understood, intellectually and in the deep-down practical part of herself, that the most likely outcome of a disappearance this complete and this prolonged was not a reunion but a recovery. She had believed herself. She had been wrong. Detective Ramirez called her at 2:15 p.m. on October 31st, 2022. He told her that a search was being conducted on a property in Sawyer County in connection with Todd's case. He told her that cadaver dogs had alerted on 3 sites and that preliminary forensic examination suggested the possibility of buried remains at least one of those sites. He told her that nothing was confirmed yet, that the forensic archaeology process was careful and slow and that conclusions would only be drawn from evidence, not from alerts or preliminary observations. He told her he was sorry. He told her he would call again as soon as there was anything more definitive to share. He told her she should have someone with her. She thanked him in a voice that he later described as the steadiest voice I have ever heard in circumstances that should have made it impossible to be steady. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a minute. Then she called Kyle. Then Jake. Then she called Kayla, who was in class at her college in Michigan and who answered the phone with an immediate, "Mom." "What's wrong?" Because by 19 years of practice, Kayla Hofflander could detect the particular weight her mother's voice carried when something was happening. Michelle told her what the detective had said. She kept her voice level. She used precise words. She did not speculate or editorialize or add her own interpretation. When she finished, Kayla was quiet for a moment. Then Kayla said, "I'll drive. I'll be there tonight." "You don't have to, Mom. I'll be there tonight." Kyle arrived first, at 5:30 p.m. He walked in, hugged his mother for a long time without saying anything, then sat down at the kitchen table and folded his hands in front of him the way his father used to, and waited. Jake called from Duluth, too far to drive quickly. He would come in the morning. Kayla arrived at 11:45 p.m., still in her campus hoodie, having driven 4 hours without stopping for more than gas. The 4 of them, Michelle and her 3 children, sat in the kitchen together that Halloween night, the trick-or-treaters long since finished and the neighborhood quiet, and they waited together. Michelle made coffee. Kyle ate half a sleeve of crackers. Nobody turned on the television. "We didn't really talk much," Kayla said afterward. "There wasn't much to say. We were all thinking the same thing, feeling the same thing. There was something almost peaceful about it. Being together, all of us, in Dad's house. Even though we knew what was probably coming. Maybe because we knew." The forensic excavation took 6 days. 6 cold, careful, methodical days during which the Hofflander family waited, and Patricia Garza waited, and Detective Ramirez oversaw a process that was both scientifically precise and quietly, enormously sad. On the 4th day, Dr. Voss found what she was looking for. At the primary alert site, approximately 32 inches below the current ground surface, protected by the partial compression of clay-bearing soil and by the root structure of a young white birch that had grown through and around the burial area over the intervening years, they found human remains. The condition of the remains was, after nearly a decade, consistent with what Dr. Voss had expected. Significant decomposition, but also significant preservation of bone structure and, crucially, of several artifacts associated with the remains that would prove essential to identification and to the understanding of what had happened. Among those artifacts, a wedding ring. A particular style and size consistent with Michelle's description of the ring she'd placed on Todd's finger in 1996. A ring that had his name and her name and the date engraved on the interior band in letters she'd chosen herself. And a piece of orange hunting vest material. Todd always wore orange. It was his, Michelle had said once, his version of a security blanket. The first day of deer season, and he'd put on that vest and he'd just smile. This big, open, completely happy smile. Like putting on that vest meant everything was right with the world. The official identification took 4 more days, awaiting dental records comparison. On November 8, 2022, 25 days before the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, Todd Hofflander was officially identified. He had been there the whole time. 12 miles from where his truck was parked. 12 miles from where his boot prints stopped. Buried in 32 inches of Wisconsin earth on land bought by a man whose name his family had never heard, 2 months before he vanished. He'd been found. After 10 years. He'd been found. Forensic pathology, when it must work with significantly decomposed remains, is a different discipline than the acute examination of a fresh scene. It requires inference, reconstruction, the careful assembly of physical evidence into narrative. It is, Dr. Voss later said, in a way that was not self-aggrandizing but simply accurate, more like archaeology than medicine. The Wisconsin State Crime Lab received the remains from Todd Hofflander's burial site on November 9, 2022. The forensic examination was led by Dr. James Calloway, a forensic pathologist with 23 years of experience who had worked on cases ranging from industrial accidents to homicides in advanced decomposition, and who described the Hofflander examination as among the more complex I've encountered in terms of the timeline we were working with. What Calloway found, painstakingly assembled over 2 weeks of examination, was this. The remains were consistent with a male in his early to mid-40s, of the height and skeletal structure matching Todd Hofflander's known physical profile. Dental records confirmed identity definitively. The manner of death, homicide. The cause was determined from skeletal trauma, specifically, fractures of the hyoid bone and cervical vertebrae consistent with manual strangulation or strangulation by ligature. There was also evidence of peromotum fractures to 2 ribs on the right side, injuries sustained at or around the time of death, likely the result of blunt force or compression. Todd Hofflander had not gotten lost. He had not had a medical event. He had not chosen to walk away from his life. He had been killed. The sequence of events, reconstructed from physical evidence, landscape analysis, and Sandra Volk's testimony, was approximately as follows. On the morning of November 14, 2013, Todd Hofflander left his hunting blind at or around 8 a.m., following what he believed to be deer sign in a northeast direction. This was consistent with his last radio communication to Dale Bremer. Sometime between 8:15 and 9 a.m., Todd encountered, or was encountered by, one or more individuals near the logging road, approximately 80 feet from his final identified boot print location. The assault occurred in or near that location, likely in or adjacent to the logging road, which would explain both the cessation of trackable footprints and the presence of the dark truck Dale Bremer had observed. Todd's body was transported approximately 12 miles by vehicle, a distance that explains both why the extensive initial search of the immediate area found nothing, and why even the cadaver dogs, working from the point of last known contact, had not been able to locate him. He had been taken off the map. The evidence collection at the burial site also yielded materials beyond the remains themselves. A partial cord or rope, too degraded for definitive identification but consistent with a synthetic braided material. Soil samples that, under analysis, contained trace chemical signatures suggesting the partial use of an accelerant or decomposition masking agent, indicating that whoever had buried Todd had taken at least some steps to obscure the site from future detection. Not enough steps, as it turned out. 10 years and the Wisconsin seasons had done their own work. The earth had kept it secret for a long time. But not forever. It had not been able to keep it forever. There was also, retrieved from the burial site in a condition that surprised even Dr. Voss given the elapsed time, a partial shoe print in a section of compacted clay approximately 6 feet from the grave margin. It was from a work boot, size 11, partial tread pattern suggesting a brand consistent with a line manufactured between 2008 and 2014. Not definitive. Not alone. But one more thread in a rope that was getting thicker and stronger by the day. Detective Ramirez now had a homicide case. The next step was the one that had haunted this investigation since its beginning. Finding Robert Elias Cutter. Robert Elias Cutter was, as Patricia Garza had discovered years before, a man who was very good at not being found. He had effectively ceased to exist as a documented individual in 2015. No tax filings, no DMV activity, no property transactions, no employment records, no Social Security number activity that law enforcement could locate. For 7 years, he had been, in the technical language of investigative databases, a trace cold, someone whose paper trail had gone entirely dark. This is not, it should be said, impossible to achieve if you have certain things going for you: cash resources, a willingness to sever all ties to your documented identity, a knowledge of how the various systems that track ordinary citizens work, and access to the kind of infrastructure, false identity documents, off-grid housing arrangements, informal cash economy participation, that makes disappearing from the official record achievable. Robert Cutter apparently had all of these things. What he did not have, what nobody who has ever tried to truly disappear has ever fully achieved, was the ability to stop being a person, to stop interacting with the world, to stop leaving traces in the physical and social fabric of ordinary human existence. People see you. Neighbors remember you. Someone behind a counter looks at your face. A vehicle registration gets checked at a routine stop. A photograph surfaces on someone else's social media. The ghost is never entirely a ghost. Detective Ramirez coordinated with the Wisconsin Department of Justice, the FBI's regional field office in Milwaukee, and law enforcement agencies in Minnesota and Michigan to conduct what's classified as a fugitive location effort. Within the first 2 weeks following Todd's official identification and the formal issuance of a homicide investigation status, they had assembled a working profile of Cutter's likely current circumstances. The key break came from an unexpected direction. Sandra Vogt, in a follow-up interview with Detective Ramirez, mentioned something she hadn't thought to include in her initial testimony. Robert Cutter had a half-brother. A man she'd met once, briefly, at a bar in Duluth in 2013. His name was Dennis. Last name different, Cutter's mother had remarried. Sandra remembered he lived somewhere in the up of Michigan and that the two brothers had what she described as a complicated relationship. They didn't get along, but Robert kept track of him. He knew where Dennis was, Sandra said. He always knew. It seemed important to him, even though he acted like he didn't care about family. It took the FBI's field office 12 days to locate Dennis Cutter Harrelson, living in a small community outside of Ironwood, Michigan, working as a part-time mechanic. Dennis Cutter Harrelson, when visited by 2 agents and a Michigan State Police detective on a Wednesday morning in November 2022, showed the classic indicators of a man who has been waiting for a conversation he knew was eventually coming. He was not warm. He was not cooperative. But he was afraid. And afraid people, Detective Ramirez had learned in 18 years of police work, talk sooner or later. The question is only how long before later arrives. In Dennis Cutter Harrelson's case, it took 3 hours of careful, non-confrontational conversation. He told them what he knew. Not everything. Agents were confident he was withholding specifics that he'd reveal only under the protection of formal immunity agreement. But enough. Enough to confirm the outline of what had happened. Enough to confirm that Robert Cutter had, as of approximately 8 months prior, been living under a different name in a rural community in northern Montana. And enough to confirm something else, something that sent the investigation sideways in a direction nobody had anticipated. The second name. The co-member of the LLC. The person Patricia Garza had identified in 2016 and kept quiet for 6 years while she built enough evidence to speak it with confidence rather than reckless accusation. Dennis confirmed it. And the name, when it finally entered the official record, arrived like a stone into still water, creating ripples that were still expanding outward when this story reached the point where it could be told. Robert Cutter was located on December 3, 2022, in a community called Loma Vista, outside of Havre, Montana. He was living under the name Gerald Marsh, had been since approximately 2016. He had a small property. He drove an older truck. He kept entirely to himself. His nearest neighbors had lived a quarter-mile away for 4 years and described him as someone they'd waved at twice. He was arrested at 6:45 a.m. on December 3rd by a joint team of Montana Highway Patrol and FBI agents. He was taken into custody without incident, a phrase that has specific meaning in this context, which is that he offered no physical resistance. Whether this was because he understood that resistance was futile, or whether it was something else, some quality of resolution, even relief in being finally caught, is something that only Robert Cutter knows. He was 53 years old. He looked older, gray, weathered, diminished by years of hiding in a way that hiding always eventually diminishes a person. He was taken to the Blaine County Detention Facility, where he was held pending extradition to Wisconsin. He declined to speak without an attorney. He was extradited to Sawyer County, Wisconsin on January 11, 2023. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. And in those first days after his arrest, as the Wisconsin media began to pick up the story, and as the Hofflander family processed what it meant to finally have a face and a name and a charge after 10 years of nothing, The second name still hadn't been released publicly. But it was coming. There are betrayals that are comprehensible. Someone driven by greed, by desperation, by a history of violence, by a moral architecture that was always going to lead to destruction. These are betrayals that, while monstrous, have a logic to them. You can trace the thread. You can see how someone became capable of something terrible. And then there are the other kind. The betrayals that come from inside the circle of trust that human beings extend to one another in the course of ordinary, loving life. The betrayals that, when they emerge into the light, don't just explain the crime, they reframe everything that came before it. Every memory, every conversation, every moment of assumed safety in the presence of someone you thought you knew. The second person charged in connection with Todd Hofflander's death was not a stranger. He was not a shadowy figure from the margins of Todd's life. His name was Dale Bremer. Dale Bremer, Todd's hunting partner of 14 years. The man who'd called Michelle on that Saturday evening, voice full of apparent distress, telling her he hadn't seen Todd since Thursday morning. The man who'd conducted his own search through Thursday night and all of Friday. The man who'd sat across from investigators in those first, urgent days and told them about the last radio communication. "Yep, copy that. Talk to you then," with what everyone who was present described as genuine anguish on his face. The man who'd told Patricia Garza, 2.5 years later, about the dark truck on the logging road. Partial information. Carefully calibrated. Just enough to create the appearance of a cooperating witness. Not enough to actually point anywhere useful. The realization of what Dale Bremer had done, not just in participating in whatever had happened to Todd Hofflander on November 14, 2013, but in maintaining his constructed grief over 10 years, in watching Michelle and Kyle and Jake and Kayla Hofflander search and wait and suffer through a decade of not knowing, was something that Detective Ramirez, in a later interview, said he found more personally difficult than anything else in the case. "I've worked homicides," Ramirez said. "I understand, in an occupational sense, that people kill people. I've come to understand the spectrum of human capacity for violence. But the 10 years of watching that family, being there, at Hayward events, seeing Michelle, being part of the community that rallied around them, that's something different. That's a different kind of thing." What had happened? What emerged from the evidence, from Robert Cutter's eventual cooperation under the weight of the evidence against him, and from Dale Bremer's own ultimate accounting, was this. Dale Bremer and Robert Cutter had known each other for several years before November 2013, through a shared involvement in what investigators described as a long-standing illegal timber harvesting operation in the Northwoods region, a scheme that involved cutting timber from state and federal land, running it through legitimate mill accounts under false provenance documentation, and distributing the proceeds through a network of small LLCs. The Sawyer County land purchase had been, in part, a mechanism for money laundering related to this operation. Todd Hofflander, in the months before his death, had stumbled across evidence of this operation without fully understanding what he'd found. He'd been doing work on a property adjacent to one of the affected parcels in the summer of 2013, a construction job that brought his crew into the area over several weeks. He'd noticed things, unmarked logging activity, fresh stumps where there shouldn't be fresh stumps, vehicles at odd hours. He'd asked questions of local contacts that had reached the wrong ears. He hadn't gone to law enforcement. He wasn't certain enough. He was, by nature, a man who preferred to understand something fully before he acted on it. But he'd mentioned it to Dale. Of course he had. Dale was his oldest hunting friend. Dale was the person he talked to about the things he was working through. Dale had reported the conversation to Cutter, and from that point, the geometry of what happened on November 14th had been set in motion. Dale Bremer was arrested on January 19, 2023, at his home in Radisson. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide as party to a crime and with obstruction of justice, the latter charge covering the 10 years of carefully maintained silence and the strategically partial testimony designed to misdirect investigators. He was 69 years old. When the arresting officers led him out to the patrol car in the gray January morning, one of his neighbors, a woman who had brought food to Dale's house in the weeks after Todd vanished, who had attended the community search efforts, who had watched Dale grieve alongside the Hofflander family at a memorial service held at Todd's church in December 2013, was standing in her driveway, having come outside to get her mail. She stood there and watched them put Dale in the car. And then she sat down on her front steps in the snow, in her housecoat, in the Wisconsin January cold, and put her hands over her face. The neighbors said she sat there for a long time. Detective Ramirez met with the Hofflander family on January 20th, 2023, the day after Dale Bremer's arrest. He sat across from Michelle, Kyle, Jake, and Kayla in a conference room at the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department. Patricia Garza was there too, at Michelle's request, there for the unofficial human dimension of a moment that the official record would reduce to a briefing. Ramirez walked them through it. All of it. From the timber scheme to Cutter to the burner phone calls to the morning of November 14th to the land purchase to the burial to Sandra Volk's testimony to Dennis's disclosure to the arrests. He spoke carefully. He used plain language. He answered questions. He did not rush. Kyle didn't move during the briefing. He sat with his arms crossed and his face completely still and his eyes fixed on a point in the middle of the table. Not looking away. Not looking at anyone. Just processing. Taking it in with the deliberate, controlled effort of a man who has trained himself over 10 years not to react until he has all the information. When Ramirez finished, Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dale was there when they did it?" "Yes," Ramirez said. Kyle nodded once. Just once. And then his face changed, not dramatically, not with the kind of collapse that the movies show, but something shifted, very slightly, in the set of his jaw and the tension around his eyes, and Patricia Garza saw it and understood what it was. The particular grief of learning that the person you thought was grieving alongside you was the reason you were grieving in the first place. Jake was already crying by the midpoint of the briefing, quietly, without apparent embarrassment, tears running steadily while he kept his eyes on Ramirez and kept nodding, following every word, needing to understand every word. Michelle sat with her hands folded on the table and listened to everything with the composure of someone who has been preparing for something so long that when it arrives, the preparedness is the thing that carries you through. Her face was not blank. It was very much inhabited, very present, very alive with emotion. But it was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who made a decision years ago about how to be present for her children in the hardest moments, and who was living that decision right now. Kayla was the one who asked the question that nobody else had asked. She was 19, the youngest, the one who had grown up most completely in the shadow of the story. She waited until Ramirez had finished the entire account, and then she said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely sure of itself, "Did he know? At the end, did he know it was Dale?" Ramirez paused. "We believe," he said, based on the investigative reconstruction, that the initial encounter on the logging road involved both individuals. So, yes, we believe he would have known. Kayla looked at the table. Then she said, "Okay." And then she didn't say anything else for a long time. After the formal briefing, after Ramirez had answered every question and given them every piece of information he was permitted to share, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Michelle Hofflander said, to the room and to no one in particular, "He knew those woods. He was good in those woods. He would have been fine out there." Everyone understood what she was saying. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even really an observation. It was a statement of fact that had taken 10 years to be able to make fully. He hadn't failed in the woods. The woods hadn't taken him. The thing that had been most feared, that somewhere in the expanse of the forest he'd simply failed, fallen, gotten turned around, hadn't been what happened. He'd been taken. He'd been killed. By people who knew him. In the place he loved most. He would have been fine, Michelle said again. And she nodded once, and pressed her lips together, and that was the end of the briefing. Robert Elias Cutter was tried in Sawyer County Circuit Court beginning in September 2023. The trial lasted 11 days. It drew regional and national media attention. The combination of a 10-year cold case, a buried hunting victim, a timber fraud scheme, and the particular horror of Dale Bremer's betrayal made it the kind of case that true crime audiences followed obsessively and that local communities processed with a combination of grief and civic determination to see it through properly. The prosecution's case was built on 4 pillars: the forensic evidence from the burial site, Sandra Volk's testimony, Dennis Cutter Harrelson's testimony, provided under a limited cooperation agreement, and the financial records that, once investigators had the right threads to pull, unraveled the timber scheme with damning thoroughness and placed both Cutter and Bremer at its center, providing the motive for Todd's killing. The defense argued that the physical evidence was insufficient to place Cutter as the direct perpetrator of the killing, that Sandra Volk's testimony was that of a self-interested witness with reason to deflect attention from her own knowledge of the scheme, and that the forensic evidence, while establishing a burial site, could not definitively establish Cutter's personal involvement in the death. It was, as defense arguments go, coherent. It was not enough. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Michelle Hofflander was in the courtroom every single day of the trial. Kyle and Jake attended when their work schedules permitted. Kayla attended the final 4 days, having arranged leave from her college. They sat together, behind the prosecution table, in the kind of proximity that families develop when they've been sharing a weight for a very long time and have learned the particular comfort of being physically close to one another. On September 29, 2023, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree intentional homicide. Guilty on 2 additional charges of criminal conspiracy. Guilty on 4 charges related to the timber fraud scheme. When the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom was very quiet. Quiet in the way courtrooms get when the verdict is both expected and still, when it arrives, overwhelming. Michelle closed her eyes. Kyle put his arm around his mother. Jake pressed the inside of his wrist, where the tattoo was, the antlers and the date, against his mouth and held it there for a moment. Kayla looked straight ahead. Robert Cutter, standing, received the verdict with no visible expression. He had, over the course of the trial, projected a quality of absolute internal withdrawal, as if he had departed from his own face some time ago and left only the physical machinery of himself behind. He was sentenced on November 2, 2023, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dale Bremer's trial was held separately, beginning in February 2024. His was in some ways the more emotionally charged of the 2 proceedings, because the community that had to watch it was the same community in which he had lived for 30 years, the same community that had rallied around the Hofflander family with him, that had included him in their shared grief, that had to now sit in the pews of the courthouse and reckon with what it meant that their grief had been, in part, a performance. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution faced the same evidentiary challenges as in the Cutter trial, compounded by Dale Bremer's age, his long community standing, and a defense that leaned heavily on the argument that Bremer had been a peripheral participant, present but not the primary actor, a man who had made a terrible choice in a moment of pressure and had then compounded it with a silence driven not by callousness but by fear. The jury took 4 days. Guilty. First-degree intentional homicide as party to a crime. Obstruction of justice. Dale Bremer was 70 years old when sentenced. He was given life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years, meaning he would be 95 before he could apply. In practical terms, it was a life sentence. He declined to make a statement at sentencing. Outside the courthouse afterward, standing in the February cold, Michelle Hofflander spoke to the gathered press for approximately 90 seconds. She said, "Todd deserved better than what happened to him. Our family deserved better. This community deserved better. I'm glad the truth is out. I'm glad there's been accountability. I'll never be glad he's gone. I will never be glad for any of this. But I'm grateful that we know. After everything we know." She went back inside. There is a particular type of person in the world of criminal investigation that doesn't get romanticized the way detectives get romanticized on television or in movies. They don't have the dramatic, violent confrontations or the dramatic revelations under interrogation lights. They work in retired bedrooms and at kitchen tables and on laptops at library desks. They carry cold cases in their heads and their hearts the way other people carry old songs. Always there, always accessible, never quite finished. Patricia Garza was one of these people. She had joined the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department in 1994. She had worked Todd Hofflander's case from the November day it arrived on her desk until she retired in 2018, and then she had continued to work it from her home, on her own time, without compensation, without formal authority, until October 2022 when a contact form message from Duluth reopened the official investigation. She was 61 years old when Todd Hofflander was identified. She was 62 when Robert Cutter was convicted. 63 when Dale Bremer was sentenced. At the Bremer sentencing, sitting in the gallery behind the Hofflander family, she had permitted herself exactly one moment of visible emotion. When the judge read the verdict, she had closed her eyes briefly and exhaled, a slow, complete exhalation, the kind that empties a person entirely, and then opened her eyes and held herself still. In the months after the trials, multiple media outlets attempted to profile Garza. She became, briefly, a well-known figure in the circles that follow true crime cases and cold case investigations. She declined most of the requests with characteristic directness. "I'm not a story. The Hofflanders are the story." She gave one interview to a Wisconsin public radio program about cold case investigations that ran in the spring of 2024. In it, she was asked what had kept her working the case for so many years after her official retirement. She was quiet for a moment. "I kept thinking about those kids," she said. "Kyle and Jake and Kayla. I kept thinking about them growing up without their dad, without knowing what happened. I thought about Kayla, 9 years old when he disappeared. I thought about all the things she was going to go through without her father there. All the things that fathers are there for. I kept thinking, I can't fix that. Nobody can fix that. But maybe I can find the truth. Maybe that's the thing I can actually do." She paused. "And I thought about him. About Todd. 20 years in those woods. Knew them like the back of his hand. A man who helped other people who got lost up there, and then he got taken, not by the woods, not by chance, not by any failure of his own, taken by people he trusted. I thought that deserved to be known. I thought the truth about it deserved to be in the light. She looked at the interviewer. I just never got to the point where I could put it down, she said. Some things you can't put down. The Sawyer County Sheriff's Department commended Garza formally in a ceremony in March 2024. Sheriff Corcoran, the same Sheriff Corcoran who had stood in the driveway with Michelle Hofflander and watched the last search truck pull away 11 years before, presented her with the department's highest civilian commendation. He struggled, visibly, to get through the formal language of the citation. When he finished, Garza shook his hand, accepted the commendation with grace, and said, "I just didn't stop. Anyone who cared as much would have done the same." This was, as everyone present understood, not entirely true. But it was the kind of generous untruth that some moments require. 10 years is a very long time to live with a question. It is long enough that children become adults, that the world changes around the wound so completely that the wound becomes part of the landscape rather than an interruption of it. Long enough that grief and ordinary life fuse in ways that make them impossible to separate, so that joy is always slightly shadowed and sadness is always slightly familiar, and the whole texture of daily existence is different from what it would have been. What does a family do with the truth after 10 years of not having it? Michelle Hofflander said in a later interview that the answer, for her, was simpler and harder than she'd expected. You grieve. Properly, finally. You let yourself go there. Because for 10 years you couldn't, not fully, and now you can, and it's enormous and awful and also, and I don't know if this makes sense, it's also a relief. To grieve fully. To be able to say, "He's gone, and I know it, and I can let myself feel it." That's not nothing. That's a terrible, precious thing. She held a private memorial service for Todd in November 2022, a week after his official identification. Just family and the closest friends. Not the public memorial, not the community event, but the small, honest, intimate gathering of the people who had known him best and loved him longest. She said it was the most painful and most necessary day of her life since his disappearance. She said the thing she kept coming back to was a specific memory. Todd standing in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, wearing the orange hunting vest because he was going out to scout and wouldn't wait long enough to change out of it, drinking coffee and reading a bird identification book because he'd seen something in the yard the day before he couldn't name and it was going to bother him until he figured it out. Just standing there, present and alive and slightly obsessive about the bird he couldn't identify, full of the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable particularity of himself. That's what I grieve, she said. Not the idea of him, the specific him, the exact person, his way of being in a room, his laugh, his hands, the way he'd get lost in a bird book on a Saturday morning. The specific, exact, unrepeatable person. That's what's gone. Kyle Hofflander married Gretchen in June 2023, the summer between Cutter's arrest and his trial. It was a small wedding, in Hayward, in the church where Todd and Michelle had married in 1996 and where Todd's memorial service had been held the previous November. Kyle wore his father's watch, a battered Timex that Todd had worn for 20 years and that had been found, still keeping time within a few minutes, among the personal effects recovered from the burial site. He kept it throughout the ceremony. The watch, not the wedding, made him cry. Jake left Duluth and moved back to the Hayward area in early 2024, closer to his mother, closer to his brother, back inside the gravitational field of the place where he'd grown up and the people he'd grown up with. He opened a small auto repair business. He kept the tattoo. He added to it, on the other arm, Todd's face, a portrait done from a family photograph, rendered in clean, careful lines. When asked about it, he said, he should be visible. He was a person who was visible. He was someone who walked into a room, and the room knew he was there. I want to carry that. I want it visible. Kayla graduated college in the spring of 2024 with a degree in social work. In her graduation speech, she'd been elected to speak by her class. She mentioned her father without naming him. I've grown up knowing that the most important things about being human are also the most fragile things. Presence, trust, time. I've grown up knowing not to take any of those for granted. I've grown up maybe a little older than I needed to, a little more aware of impermanence. That's a hard way to grow up. It's also, I think, a kind of gift. I know what matters. I've always known what matters. She received a standing ovation. She deserved it. Sandra Vogt, the woman who had finally spoken after 9 years of silence, moved back to Ashland, Wisconsin, in the spring of 2023. She told Ramirez she wasn't entirely sure why, that Ashland felt unresolved for her, and that she was someone who needed to resolve things rather than leave them behind. She got a job at a hospital there. She joined a book club. She was, by all accounts, doing okay. She attended neither trial. She had given her testimony via recorded deposition at her request, and the court had accommodated it. She was not a person who wanted to be in a room with Robert Cutter. This was entirely understandable. She said, in a brief statement she gave to a journalist, "I wish I had said something sooner. I will live with that. I know I had my reasons. They felt important at the time, and they feel much smaller now. But I said it when I was finally able to. And maybe that's the most honest accounting of what I managed." It was honest. It was also true. People are, in the end, capable of exactly what they're capable of at the moment they're in. The version of Sandra Vogt, who was in a relationship with a frightening man and who had 2 pieces of circumstantial information and an ocean of uncertainty, couldn't say what the version of Sandra Vogt 9 years later, safe in Duluth, could say. She'd said it when she could. Todd Hofflander's case was closed as solved on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, which nobody planned but everyone noticed, because the calendar is what it is. I want to end where we started. That trailhead in Sawyer County. That truck, alone in the parking area, on a cold November morning. That particular quality of Northwood silence, the kind that sits on you like a weight, that makes you aware of your own smallness against the vast indifference of trees and water and sky. Todd Hofflander walked away from that truck on the morning of November 14, 2013. He was 43 years old. He had a wife who loved him and 3 kids he adored, and a life that was, by any reasonable measure, a good one. Not spectacular, not glamorous, not famous or notable or exceptional in the ways that the world tends to define those words, but good. Genuinely, durably, humanly good. Built carefully by a man who understood that the things that last are the things you build carefully. He walked into the woods he'd known for 20 years with his compass and his GPS and his thermos of coffee and his 2 decades of accumulated woodcraft, and he was killed by people he trusted in a place he loved, and he was hidden for 10 years in a country of birch and pine while the people who loved him most were left in the particular hell of not knowing. And then he was found. And then the truth came out. It always does, eventually. This is not a comforting platitude. The timeline is often unacceptably long, the cost to families unacceptably high, the damage done by a decade of not knowing irreversible. Eventually, is not a just word when children grow up without a father. When a wife spends 10 years suspended between grief and hope. When a community has to look back and understand that the neighbor who stood at the search command post and cried was the reason there was a search at all. Eventually, is not enough. But it is what we have. And in this case, through the sustained work of Patricia Garza and the institutional effort of Detective Ramirez and the moral courage of Sandra Vogt and the patient, relentless determination of a family that refused to give up and refused to stop asking, it came. The truth came. I want to tell you about one more thing. In the spring of 2024, the Hofflander family planted a tree. Not at the burial site. That ground, while part of the official investigation's history, is not the ground they chose to mark. They chose a different place. The northern ridge of the hunting property that Todd and Dale had used together for 20 years, the section of the Chequamegon National Forest where Todd had made his blind and watched the deer work the tree line and felt the particular peace that came to him only in the woods. The section where his final boot prints were found. They planted a white pine. White pines grow slowly and live long, 200 years or more. A white pine planted in 2024 will still be standing when no one who knew Todd Hofflander is still alive. Kyle and Jake dug the hole. Michelle set the root ball in the earth. Kayla backfilled. They worked without speaking, the way families work when words aren't the right tool for the moment. When it was done, they stood around the young tree in the late April afternoon light, the forest just beginning to green around them, the light coming through the birches at that particular golden angle that Northwood springs produce, that makes even ordinary things look briefly sacred. Nobody gave a speech. Nobody had to. They stood there for a while. Together, in the woods that had belonged to Todd and would now hold a piece of him, the long memory of a growing thing, the patient life of a tree that would outlast all of them, standing in the place where he'd been most fully himself. Then they walked back down the ridge to the truck. And they drove home. Todd Michael Hofflander. March 9th, 1970 to November 14th, 2013. Husband. Father, friend, woodsman. He knew those woods. He would have been fine. If this story moved you, if Todd's case, his family's decade of searching, and the painstaking work of the people who finally found the truth affected you in the way it affected me, please take a moment right now and subscribe if you haven't already. This channel is dedicated to telling stories like this one. Not for shock value. Not for entertainment in any cheap or easy sense. But because real stories, stories about real people and what they endure and what they find on the other side of unimaginable things, matter. They matter because they're true. They matter because the people in them are real. They matter because the world is full of families living right now in the same suspended state that Michelle and Kyle and Jake and Kayla Hofflander lived in for 10 years, and those families deserve to be seen. If you know someone affected by a missing persons case, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults is at 1-800-THE-LOST. In Wisconsin, the Department of Justice maintains a missing and unidentified persons database that families and investigators can access directly. And if you have information about an unsolved case, however partial, however uncertain, however long you've been sitting on it, please consider making the call. Sandra Vogt waited 9 years. She will always wish she'd called sooner. Don't wait. Thank you for watching. Thank you for spending this time with Todd Hofflander's story. He deserved to be found.